Okay, great. All right. Hello and welcome, everyone. Um, Thank you so much for joining our workshop today. My name is Maisha Hayes. I am the Senior Movement Building Director at Media Justice. We are a national organization that fights to put people in control of the media and technology that shapes our everyday lives and our futures. I'll be the moderator for today's conversation, and I am honored to be joined by two incredible experts that I'll introduce in just a few moments. But before we dive in, I just wanted to say a few words to ground us in today's conversation and the conversation that we're about to have. As someone who's been in the tech justice space for a number of years, and I've been in several spaces where we've talked about the rise of fascism and authoritarianism, both here in the United States and globally, um, and how tech companies are positioning themselves in the midst of this changing political climate. But it feels really important and even necessary to say plainly now that we're no longer witnessing a rise, but we're really, um, rather living through fascism unfold in real time. In reality, governments are using every tool at their disposal to surveil, silence, and criminalize those fighting for justice and liberation. As we know, this is especially true for activists fighting to end the genocide and occupation in Palestine. But it's not just governments acting alone. Some of the most powerful players fueling this repression and state violence are tech companies such as Meta, Google, Microsoft. They have positioned themselves to be the central pillar and the architecture of state violence, colluding with repressive governments to make large-scale surveillance, control, targeting, and erasure possible at a massive scale. So while the threats that we're facing today aren't entirely new, they have certainly intensified and only escalated. So it's incredibly important and urgent that we unpack the role that tech companies are playing at this very moment. So for today's conversation, I am thrilled to be joined by Sana Ansari Khan, the Digital Spaces Project Director at Muslim Counterpublics Lab, as well as Man Hamad, the Tech Accountability Campaigner at ECHO. Before we get started, do you two want to share any information about your respective orgs before we hop into the discussion? Or should we just hop right in?
I think so, yeah.
Okay, let's hop right in. All right. So the first question that I have for the two of you is, one of the images that's been really stuck in my mind for the last few months has been Inauguration Day, and seeing the CEOs of the major tech companies sitting directly behind Trump. Looking back on it, I feel like that moment was more than just symbolic, but a really explicit declaration that tech companies have aligned itself with the ideologies and agenda of this like fascist movement in the United States. So I'm curious to know, what did this moment represent for you? And how is that alignment playing out and how these companies are operating?
I can start. It's so nice to be in company with you both and all of the people attending. And Hamna, thank you so much for organizing another incredible conference to put us all together. I feel like it felt in a lot of ways really sobering to see what so many of us who've been in this fight have been sort of recognizing as you so beautifully put, not sort of just a trend or a rise, but a very real sort of material, unfortunate reality. And I feel as if these tech companies being front and center during the inauguration of Donald Trump for his second presidency was revealing, because it sort of showed them as, or if not more important than, the new sort of arms manufacturers of our era. And I think these arms manufacturers, and I use this phrase sort of on purpose, is because in the same way that there needs to be a resistance against them, we sort of have to frame them as this new culprit in this anti-war movement that we all have to take quite seriously. And I feel as if tech companies have been sort of cloaked with this, innovation cloak that leads them to be sort of cool and savvy and Silicon Valley-y. And most people understand big tech sort of violations sort of as like a moderation issue, and not that that's not a problem. I feel like moderation has been and is continuing to be a huge problem. And there's some research that I can show later on in our conversation. But what's more damning is the sort of rise in this AI warfare and the mechanisms of war that these big tech companies are sort of facilitating. And I mean, you have to look at companies like Microsoft or Google and Amazon, who are actually providing the actual infrastructure and data loads to kill Palestinians, to surveil Palestinians, testing on us as Palestinians in the occupied West Bank and Gaza, so that they can export this technology to other defunct governments around the world. And this is not in the abstract. I'm Palestinian American, and I split my time between the U.S. and Palestine. 3 weeks ago, as I was going to my grandmother's village to hang out with her, Israeli soldiers stopped our shared bus, took out their phone, scanned each of our faces, not even needing our IDs anymore. And I feel as if the understanding of the occupation as checkpoints and IDs and the sort of architecture of control is actually being changed and facilitated by companies like Microsoft, who hold my face, hold my fingerprint in their data load so that the IDF can benefit from it and operationalize its occupation. Every day I wake up to the disturbing news of Palestinians murdered by Israeli airstrikes, supported again by Google, Amazon, and Microsoft, and the data and the AI that they're facilitating. So it's heartbreaking and damning, but to see them front and center with Donald Trump, like I said, was in a way quite sobering to see as headlines and across the news channels where it was presented.
Thank you so much. Sanaa, how about you?
Thank you, Maisha, and thank you, Ma'in, and thank you, Hamma, for having us. I, really honor everything that Ma'in said in the Palestinian context, and so I think something that I can speak on is how you'd asked Maisha about the alignment of tech companies with authoritarian governments. I can speak to in the U.S. context, right? And so there's, a few things I wanted to touch on today, and that those are, one, what documented repression amongst tech companies has been in the U.S. context, and then I want to speak a little bit of our digital rights report that we recently published, and finally, I want to just connect Ma'in's experience in Palestine with, obviously it's by no means on the same scale because of genocide, but we can look at the repression, being mechanized as kind of being like an imperial boomerang, right? And so I'm going to finish with that. But first, when we look at the U.S. context and we're talking about the repression amongst these companies, since October 2023, there's been increased censorship on social media platforms, including Meta, X, TikTok, and these companies use content moderation frameworks that claim to protect communities from hate speech in order to silence Palestinian human rights advocates, right? And so this authoritarian kind of attack on free speech also extends to financial platforms, where reports emerged that Venmo, for example, froze accounts of Palestinian Americans that were sending funds to families in Gaza, citing suspicious activity without any transparency, right? So again, there's the authoritarian bent goes from the top down, right? So you're looking at the government, and then you're looking at the tech companies that are aligned with the government, and they really don't feel any need to be accountable or answerable to their user base. They provide no transparency with respect to the repressive measures that they take, in addition to the cooperation that they provide to authoritarian governments to, as Ma'in said, mechanize the oppression. So, with advertising, we also saw Google's ad policies promoted anti-Palestinian rhetoric on YouTube, while Palestinian-led campaigns were flagged for violating community standards. Again, it's the decision of who gets to speak and who doesn't. And of course, journalists in Gaza reported their sudden account suspensions, severing critical communication lines for them during Israeli bombardments. And most, I think, egregiously are the two things, like the data sharing partnerships that we're seeing between the companies and the government, right? So in early 2025, Facebook announced a data sharing agreement with U.S. Customs and Immigration to strengthen immigration enforcement, supplying demographic analytics and network mapping tools. Google and Microsoft maintained similar MOUs with local police departments, granting real-time access to live stream metadata and cloud vision AI outputs under public safety exemptions. And this, again, was reported by the ACLU. And then, perhaps like the most egregious, I think, report that we saw over the past year and a half was a suspected WhatsApp collaboration with the Israeli military to identify which Palestinians to kill. And so you're seeing, not only are these tech companies mechanizing the oppression within the Palestinian context, but these are American companies that are mechanizing the oppression in Palestine. And now you're going to start seeing that imperial boomerang come back, where those tried and tested methods that have been executed in Palestine are reverberating back to the US, right? They're going back to the imperial core. I'm going to speak on that, but one thing I wanted to mention was that we, Muslim Counterpublics Lab, just released its digital rights report, and I put the link in the chat for anybody who would like to go and download it. But our report confirmed that Muslim Americans had experienced this repression when advocating for issues like Palestine, right? And so our research revealed that Muslim Americans surveyed had personally experienced this alignment of the tech industry with authoritarian government, and specifically with respect to surveillance on the platforms. And like one of our conversations that I thought was really interesting with our research subjects was that activists had anxiety specifically around private groups using Facebook source data and facial recognition to identify and flag, for example, pro-Palestinian student protesters for persecution and prosecution, including deportation. And this looks like right-wing groups like Canary Mission leveraging Facebook's APIs, Google search visibility, and even the deployment of Microsoft and Amazon-powered facial recognition tools on campus footage to identify and flag students to ICE under counterterrorism pretext for detention and deportation. And so, our research confirmed that Muslim American activists concerned centered around private, especially right-wing groups, big tech platforms, and government agencies, forming like a triangular alliance that amplifies this repression, and specifically around Palestine solidarity. And so I just wanted to finish with the imperial boomerang in action, right? So the same takedown and surveillance infrastructures that were built to stifle dissent in Cairo, in New Delhi, and how Martin described the mechanized oppression in Palestine, these infrastructures are now being used to police student protesters in Michigan and California. And this, and also the outsourced surveillance to private third parties that, we discussed earlier, is a method that intentionally blurs the lines between public law enforcement and private actors, which also replicates colonial style intelligence gathering on US soil. And so all of this really, in our research for Muslim Americans and especially activists, they describe the chilling effect on their speech, knowing that even their private group chats could be subpoenaed directly from platform servers. So this really just shows that, activists in the US facing shadow bans, account suspensions, and chilling effects that mimic the digital repression that were once believed to only be confined to authoritarian regimes abroad are coming back home.
Mm-hmm. That's right. Thank you for that breakdown and helping us connect the dots. The imperial boomerang is really a helpful visual. Maya, I wanted to, that's a great segue into one of our questions about content moderation on these platforms, and how social media is really shaping our collective understanding of what's happening in Palestine. And Maya, I know you have done a lot of research into this, so I wanted to pull you into this question about, given what you have uncovered in your work, how are platforms shaping and controlling the narratives that we see around Palestine? Any thoughts you want to share about changes in content moderation policy, surveillance, and censorship? How is this all shaping our experience in these digital spaces?
Yeah, I think it's interesting that we're in a Hamla conference, and I would be remiss if I don't mention Hamla's incredible job at leading sort of the content moderation front when it comes to Palestine, and showing so many of these different pitfalls that partners have relied so heavily on. And I'm thinking of the report Hamla has done with Human Rights Watch and Access Now, their continued monitoring, and I'll plug some of their links in a moment. And I feel that many of us in the room probably know of how Meta, as an example, fails to allow Palestinians or human rights by sort of proactively silencing Palestinian free speech in and around many different sort of contexts, as early as some of the different uprisings that have taken on way before this ongoing genocide. I'm thinking of the Unity Uprising in 2021, for example. But I think one thing that people often don't realize is that Meta, again, as an example, you can plug in Meta with any of the other big tech companies, has also at the same time been proactively supporting the Israeli regime in different ways through failing to content moderate. Mm-hmm. And one of the examples I wanted to highlight today was a research report we did late last year that showed how Meta was allowing genocidal narratives to be monetized on its advertising platform. And I'll give like a 2-second summary of ad tech and the advertising platform, just because of how important it is to its business model. These big tech and social media companies, again, cloaked in innovation, are nothing more than advertising companies. They receive billions of dollars every year. It's what fuels and funds how they operate. And they will literally take money from anybody, including the Israeli regime, far-right lawmakers who are pushing genocidal narratives. And I'll talk a little bit about that in our report that we did. So we had uncovered that Meta was actively profiting from and facilitating from the spread of genocidal narratives, and at the same time directly helping support military fundraising efforts for Israel by far-right Israeli groups. And I want to break this down into sort of two things. Again, because I think most people are so focused on how much they're silencing Palestinians, they're not realizing how much they're actually amplifying genocidal narratives from the Israeli regime and far-right actors. So inside of Israel, the platform was allowing Israeli lawmakers to do targeted ads across the country, including from settler groups, running advertisements filled with hate speech, incendiary language, dehumanizing language, calling Palestinians Amalek, which is a Hebrew word sort of used to entertain the killing of Palestinians. And extreme factions within Israel's political landscape were using and exploiting Meta's advertising tools to run these ads, targeting millions of Israelis, and they're still continuing to do it, pushing the very harmful disinformation and hate speech narratives that have led to where we are right now, meaning that Israelis inside of Israel are being targeted by the most fringe far-right groups inside of Israel using Meta's platforms. Okay. And at the same time, so that's happening inside of Israel. Outside of it, far-right groups in the US are using its advertising platform to target military fundraising ads for advanced military equipment and weaponry, including drones that can be equipped with rigged explosives that are killing Palestinians, advanced telescopic sights for sniper rifles, bulletproof vests, night vision goggles, all of which are running on their platform where they're making money, allowing far-right groups to fundraise to then send advanced military equipment to Israel. And I want to share my link or my screen just for a moment here, just to share, because I every time I give this presentation, I check the same advertisers to see if anything has happened. We flagged these to Meta. We got media pickup. So we did everything that an NGO ought to do.
Mhm.
I want to show where the pitfall happens and how the company itself fails to continue to check. Can you all see my screen?
Mhm.
This is just one of the advertisers we found, and there's ads running. All of these ads are still running, and I'll show you an example. Just let me know if you can hear the audio.
I can't hear the audio, but mm.
You can see, you know, Meta gives us the opportunity to see how many people are seeing it, where it's getting targeted, all of these different tools, but they're refusing to sort of stop the problem in and of itself, which is allowing the most fringe, radical, far-right groups use and exploit their platforms for the benefit of this genocidal regime.
Mhm. Mhm. Thank you so much, Mayan, for breaking that down. Sanaa, did you have anything you wanted to add, given the report that you referenced? I know you talked quite a bit about the content moderation policies in your first response, but I just wanted to loop back.
Yeah, I mean, I think like with respect to social media platforms and how they're shaping and controlling narratives, especially around Palestine. I mean, I think Martin's identification of like the ad libraries is so interesting, and like just to like zoom out, I kind of look at it like there's how activists shape public perception or how they can, and then how states and private actors shape public perception, and then how the platforms themselves shape public perception. And I just kind of it's kind of like a zooming out. I just wanted to touch on a few points, but like when it comes to activists, like it's I think one thing that we recognized in our report as well was the double-edged sword nature of social media platforms, in the sense that the same technology that's used to track, surveil, and identify activists for prosecution by the state potentially is the same technology that activists rely on for disseminating their own experiences and narratives to shape public perceptions, right? And so our report really kind of confirmed that activists relied on social media platforms to connect, spread awareness, and build movement and momentum. And recent polling on U.S. views on Palestine since October 23 have shown an increase in support for Palestine that hasn't been seen in generations, right? Like there's more criticism of Israel, and there's a lot of speculation that is due to the social media narratives that have been able to kind of break through the mainstream kind of stranglehold that we've had, right? Because the state controls that completely. And so Israel and the US have always had an advantage with respect to controlling the media culture and narratives around Palestine and Israel. And social media was a tool to break through that, right? And so, but on the other end, we also see that states and private actors are using social media to shape public perception, much in the same way that Martin showed, right? And so, you're seeing the rampant increase of resources that the state and right-wing actors are devoting to online repression. But this also confirms that the threat that social media poses to the status quo narrative, right? And so, I think Martin's ad library identification showed that, I think a 2024 study found that like 72% of U.S. users had were exposed to Israel-Palestine content on Meta platforms encountered pro-Israel narratives, right? So we're seeing that be the dominant one from the states and the platforms, and the platforms meaning through paid content, right? And then, of course, there's how platforms are shaping the public perception, and they're doing this by suppressing certain hashtags and content, leading to narratives that are skewed in favor of their bottom dollar, right? And so, news repeat. This is really key case was that news reports and our research interviews confirmed that platforms repeatedly removed pro-Palestinian content citing hate speech or national security, even when similar speech for other causes remained uncensored. And I just want to finish with one thing, which is that platforms, they're shaping, along with the competing activists and states, more in collaboration with the states, but platforms not only shape the narratives online, but they're also shaping real life repression schemes as well, right? And this is kind of interesting because it's not just our understanding of what's happening in Palestine that's being shaped by the platforms, but also the methods of repression against activists that's also being shaped by these companies. So you take, for example, the weaponization of content moderation as a political tool. So during pro-Palestine campus encampments, universities also labeled solidarity speech as harassment or hate, and even model these policies on the platforms in order to justify their disciplining of students under this political speech as hate speech paradigm. And so this is a normalization of that. And so, yeah, I'll stop there.
I appreciate how much you both talked about censorship, but then the amplification of hate speech through their advertising model. And I think one of the greatest myths about social media platforms is while us as users might see these platforms as places to connect, and as you said, Sana, disseminate our messages, mobilize people. These are advertising companies. That's their bread and butter. And so I would love to get your thoughts on how are tech companies shielding themselves from all of the bad PR, their alignment with fascism and authoritarianism. How are they so good at keeping us seeing these platforms as one thing when at the end of the day, these are companies that are about their bottom line, that are about profit, that are about advertising. How does that happen? Curious to get your thoughts.
Sana, do you want to go? I'm happy to.
Oh no, please go ahead. Go ahead.
It's a good question. I mean, I think for so long, the companies themselves were much smaller scale and not as entrenched in the sort of military industrial complex as they are nowadays. And not to say that they've never been. I mean, you can look back into history and see Microsoft, for example, operating and sharing data and chips with apartheid South Africa. It's not that they're void from this sort of legacy. I just think that military warfare, fascism has become hyper digital these days. And these companies are the gatekeepers to these tools. These companies are also power and profit hungry. It's embedded in their business model. So that's why you have all of the tech CEOs sort of buddying up to the Trump administration. That's why just 2 days ago, Satya, the CEO of Microsoft at the biggest tech conference in the company, had Elon Musk on stage, and it's as if that meant nothing, He was speaking to him as Elon, the AI tech expert, not Elon, CEO or king of Doge. And their ability to sort of wear these different hats, I think, is part of the chameleon effect that they have in entrenching themselves in so much of our lives. So much so that even me, as somebody in this space, I'm learning more and more every day how much they're intersected in my life, right? Whether it's through targeted advertising, whether it's through holding the data loads of my eyes in a soldier's iPhone, whether it's the expansion of facial recognition technology, even in airports in the US, all of it has different ways where the tech companies, as these sort of gatekeepers to power, are becoming buddy with those holding the sort of keys to all of the different ways that our world is becoming more militarized and more violent. Again, sort of using this cloak of innovation to sort of dodge so much of this culpability.
So now, do you have any thoughts about what kind of, I don't know, tactics, strategies that these tech companies are using to kind of shield themselves from all the bad PR and, you know, their alignment with these repressive governments?
It's really interesting. Like, one thing I think about is kind of the narrative arc that we've seen on about these platforms, and I'll get to that in a minute. But when you're talking about PR at this point, I feel like there was a time in like the mid 2010s when they did care a little bit about their reputation with users, maybe because they were still at the stage of like trying to build their user base. But now, like, the US market is like so saturated. They've kind of like tapped it out. It's almost like I think that most people would agree they don't care about their PR anymore. Like, they are happily, like, we started this conversation out with attending the Trump's inauguration and just like standing there like their best friends. So they've got nothing to lose in terms of PR. Like, that kind of leverage that we thought we had as a user base in terms of trying to pressure the companies to do right by their content moderation, but specifically around ownership of our data, of transparency around their policies. We thought we could exercise that pressure. And I'm speaking from a civil rights and digital rights sort of coalition background, because I was in those spaces at that time. Like, we thought that we could exercise that pressure, and we slowly started to see that they are such a massive monopoly that they don't need to actually care about what their PR is at this point. And that's what's kind of terrifying. And I mean, I can go into the tech narratives, but maybe we stop there.
So that was a really great segue into our next question. You spoke about leverage, you spoke about their monopoly power, you spoke about, the fact that in this day and age, they don't really have to care so much about their public perception. As you were talking, in fact, you were reminding me of like back in the day in 2008, like Meta, Facebook back then was, known as the platform that Obama used, and it was associated with hope and change, and like wow, how much has changed since then, obviously. But then in addition to that, like, they don't care. Amazon doesn't care, Meta doesn't care, these companies do not care. And so sometimes, transparently, I even struggle with the word accountability in this moment. But I will ask it anyway. What does it look like to even hold these companies accountable, given the scale and influence that they have? What would real accountability look like? And please feel free to highlight any organizing tactics or campaigns that you're watching, that you're inspired by, as examples of what we should possibly support in this work.
It's a great question, and one that I feel those of us who work in this intersection are thinking about all the time. I know it's a very bleak time to be in this field. I think there's also to go back into time, not even too far away. Even a few years ago, there was a much more approachable relationship with the companies themselves and civil society. There was actually a sort of exchange in a way, and I think so much of it was optics and for the sake of ticking boxes. But nowadays, it's like even to get a meeting with some of these companies is not even feasible. And I actually think in a way that's helpful. Like, it's more helpful to know that who we're up against is actually who we're up against, instead of having a sort of facade or the sort of like respectability politics of, an hour-long meeting where they're going to show you a presentation you've seen a billion times and avoid your questions. And I think we have to confront them. And we here meaning civil society, we meaning users and the profit engine behind these companies, we meaning the employees. And I'll share sort of two tactics that I get quite excited about that we do at Echo. And for context, Echo, where I work, is a corporate accountability organization. We're member-led and have millions of members who sort of take on companies, big tech companies being some of them. Shareholder resolutions and advocacy is an incredible strategy to make sure that the campaigns and the sort of narratives that we're holding as users and investors of these companies are actually taken seriously by the executives themselves. So, for example, shareholder work can sort of bring our campaigns, quote unquote, into the boardroom that then get up for a vote with everyday shareholders and institutional investors. And in a big way, it actually was part and parcel to the long history of divestment that took down the South African racist apartheid regime. It was through shareholder work and advocacy that brought resolutions that forced companies to divest, for example. So I get really excited about that sort of work, and we've done a bit of it at Echo against Google, Meta, Microsoft in a variety of different ways. I'll give you one example where we ran a resolution against Meta in terms of their content moderation failures in its 5 largest markets. And that includes India and Brazil and a lot of the global South countries where content moderation failures are happening there by choice because they don't invest in the global South, but they would prefer to experiment and toy around with their platforms with the masses, meaning mostly Black and brown people, so that they can then also, like some militaries around the world, export that technology to the West. So we had run a resolution and sort of were able to bring India, which was at the time and still is a huge issue area for the company, being Meta at this point because of its content moderation failures that have led to very real world violence, masses and mobs of far right supremacist voices actually killing Indians a few years ago, Indian Muslims. And another thing I get really excited about is all of the incredible work that big tech workers are taking on to their companies. And I think no matter how much we work, the ability that they're able to push their companies because of the ones being behind the tech and the tools is immensely more powerful than anything an organization like ours could do. And as we speak this week, Microsoft, who runs Azure, the AI and data company that the Israeli regime so gracefully benefits from, has had 3 different panels, 2 of its biggest keynotes disrupted by Palestinian and allied workers from Microsoft. Of course, if you Google Microsoft build right now, Palestine, you'll see dozens of different headlines. And they're hijacking Microsoft's biggest tech conference in front of all of its investors, in front of all of its media, to bring Palestine and Gaza and its disgusting sponsorship of the Israeli data systems front and center to people. And it forces the company itself to reckon how much longer are they going to be able to appease Israel until they realize that it's hurting them, that they're not benefiting from it. In a really kind of absurd but kind of beautiful way. And I'm sharing this live because this news I'm following. Yesterday, they disrupted Sarah Bird, who is the quote unquote responsible AI director for Microsoft. And in disrupting her, she shut down her camera. And on the live stream, they showed by accident a leaked conversation on Microsoft Teams where she was sharing a new investment that they're doing with Walmart. And now it's leaked to the media. And I use this as an example to sort of, it's kind of like this beautiful irony. They're appeasing and breaking their back so much for Israel that they're literally exposing themselves to fiduciary risk, their shareholders, their investors, their users. And that's something, for example, that no shareholder resolution, no petition, nothing that we as researchers or campaigners can do, but something that workers on the front line are leading so beautifully on. And I'll share some of these links right now. And I implore you all to follow the No Azure for Apartheid Coalition. They're doing incredible work.
Thank you so much for those examples. As we've been as we said, like, while these are really heavy times, like, there are some incredible and courageous folks, like, still fighting and holding these tech companies accountable, however, way we mean that these days. So now I wanted to pass it to you to ask you the same, question. What does fighting these companies look like? What tactics are you watching for that you think can really shrink their power is what we're talking about?
No, for sure. Yeah, I think that the tech workers and the disruptions are definitely giving me hope. But I want to like zoom out again, like just to define, like, what does real accountability look like, right? What would it look like ideally? And like for these companies, I think it would mean that they're answerable to us as not just their users, but also their content creators, right? So it would mean transparency that allows us as users to ensure that these companies are refusing or limiting services to governments that cross red lines, publicly explaining why, and facing meaningful financial and reputational consequences when they don't, right? And so I think, we have to have like a community-centered approach to tech accountability here, right? And given the outsized role, and I'm just speaking in the social media context because that's more where my expertise is, but given the outside role that social media plays in shaping our perceptions and serving as a tool for us to connect, it's even more critical that we not relinquish control to a few powerful state and corporate elite of what is essentially our data and content that we produce, right? And so I think when it comes to tactics, we've seen like economic leverage trying to be exercised in the form of like customer and advertiser boycotts, right? So we're like, I think advertisers were pressured to boycott platforms that were hosting like hate speech, right? That was, again, I think hate speech is being weaponized in this moment, but it was an example of how coalitions had gotten together to try to put that economic pressure on the platforms to do more about not just their content moderation, but about the transparency. I think that's the bigger part is the transparency part. But I mean, another kind of lever for accountability would be litigation, right? And so we also saw lawsuits against Meta under, what were supposed to be civil rights laws that, they don't go anywhere because of the kind of regulatory hand tying that's happening. But this is, of course, like another pressure tactic, and it does get a lot of attention, and in terms of building upon all the different sort of levers that we have. You're tying up their resources too, right? So and then there's, I think, critically though, in addition to worker and insider actions that Martin also emphasized is legislative advocacy and like public pressure demands, right? And I think those things only really have any sort of sway when we're also are able to build parallel infrastructures, right? So I'm not saying that we like go out and like build our own platforms because there's networking issues with that, right? The whole point of being on platforms is that you have access to such a large audience, right? And so if we all kind of balkanize into our own little social media platforms, that's not necessarily a solution. But the idea being that, we have like decentralized archives with Gaza, journalists in Gaza, like using blockchain to preserve evidence. So we have to build infrastructures outside of dependency on these platforms in order for our other lever pressures to have any sort of hope at being impactful.
I want to like back day we used to, and by we you were talking about civil society, used to be able to get these companies to sit down at a table and engage with us, and now that's no longer the case. And I really love the fact that you said it's good that we know that. I'm curious as folks still in this civil society tech justice space, what reflections do you have about what civil society could be doing at this moment in time? You've mentioned tech workers, you've mentioned shareholder activism, but what can this particular sector of our field be doing at this moment?
I think part of it is what we're doing now. And, again, I applaud Hamla for bringing us all together. It's conversations like this and meetings where we get to see and interact with one another across this digital world of ours. It's incredibly important. And I think all of us kind of need to refocus and reorient our compass a bit, I think, also to understand the role these companies are now playing and how they're leveraging their technology for all of the bad actors that they're leveraging it for, and us not to feel shy or convinced from the sort of optics of this game, and in the same way that there was a very important anti-war movement that shut down the Vietnam War and brought the masses out for the illegal Iraqi invasion. I think we need to see ourselves as organizers and organizations as also holding some version of a baton that needs to be mobilized and moved. And it's very our reality right now is very painful and very bleak. And yes, and at the same time, we, at least I hope I can say we, meaning all of us here, I feel like can see things so much more clearly now. And there's not the sort of blurriness and the fog that sort of slows us down in how loud we can be, how quote unquote radical we ought to be. That if it's not now, when sort of framing is as important as ever. And all of us have our different tactics and tools. We all have our different sort of special powers. Some of us are researchers, some of us are campaigners, some of us are advocates. Every one of those pillars has something people ought to be doing for not just Palestine, but for this trend that we're on. I think of myself as a campaigner who can do research and advocacy. For example, this meta ads research, I'm not a technologist. I played around with the meta ad library, used Google Translate to find some of the worst hate speech in Hebrew, and found hundreds of ads. I spent time compiling in a report and pitched it to media. And I say that not to tout, I say that to share that there's a calling that all of us have in our 40 hours a week that we work to connecting these dots, whether it's for Palestine, whether it's for Sudan, whether it's for Black and brown people in the US, whether it's for your family in the US or in the West. I feel like the lines of where fascism is creeping are also not blurred. It's all of us have some stake in this, and use your power in whatever way you can to fight back against it.
How about you, Sana? What are your reflections about what civil society should be doing at this moment? Oh, you're on mute, I think.
Thanks. All right, thought I clicked it. If I'm looking at it from like a strengths and like weaknesses, I think one of the strengths that I've been happy to see within kind of the digital rights and civil rights spaces are like the audits and the scorecards and the public like naming and shaming that the organizations are doing, especially with respect to like platforms failing on human rights. It raises awareness, at least for us to approach the platforms with some skepticism, as opposed to kind of taking them at their word for being these benevolent actors. So, it's a part of like the digital literacy kind of curve where we're starting to approach the platforms with at least some healthy skepticism, right? And so that awareness building is important. And I think the digital and civil rights organizations are leading on that. I think, one of the weaknesses is like siloed campaigns, right? And so you have folks who are focused, and I mean, especially when you're looking at the social media platforms, I mean, I think what we're seeing, I'm going to say it, like, I think Gaza has cracked the facade of US civil rights frameworks. Because what we're seeing is that within what is supposed to be kind of like the leaders of civil rights and human rights in the United States, there is a camp that acknowledges that there is genocide, And then there's a camp that's completely in denial about it, and they will, you know, hell or high water, they will do whatever they have to. They will repress, they will detain, they will punish, they will retaliate anybody that they have to in order to protect this narrative, and even at the cost of their civil rights work, right? And their civil rights legacy. That's shameful, right? And so, you know, one thing I wanted to, and this, I know what I'm saying is controversial, but you know, it is what it is. We're in this moment, and we have to grapple with it. I've been in the digital and civil rights spaces for a while, civil rights moving into digital space, digital rights. But, you know, I've watched and I've been disappointed with a lot of the organizations that I was associated with. Because in this moment, you know, what we're seeing that although digital repression targets like all marginalized communities, a lot of the repression that we've talked about here today is identity specific, targeting speech, you know, such as the algorithmic deranking of Palestinian, Arab, and Muslim voices, and the surveillance of these communities in particular. But these harms have generally been overlooked by mainstream US digital and civil rights groups. And, you know, all you have to do is look not only at the orgs that lead major US civil rights coalitions, their lack of work around Gaza, or even their failure to make basic statements in solidarity with Gaza, and also how donors are punishing individual civil rights and community orgs that make even the most like milquetoast statements condemning the murder and starvation of children, right? And I think one thing that we're not talking about, or I haven't seen people talk about, is that a big part of why the civil rights and digital rights networks in the United States largely ignore this particular connection between identity and digital repression is because, one, there's rampant Islamophobia and anti-Palestinian racism, which has led to the assumption that speech from these communities is automatically hateful, anti-Semitic, or violent. Two, that hate speech policies were designed to, in part, to target these communities specifically with when they make political speech against U.S. empire and Israel in a way that we're seeing be deployed in this very moment. And then three, that these hate speech policies were largely supported by Israeli lobby groups that have co-opted the US civil and human rights regime by procuring chairs on major civil rights coalition boards, despite having a documented record of suppressing Palestine advocacy and surveilling Black activists. And that's why we are at the place that we are, where I don't think that they've done their job.
I don't think anything you said was controversial. That really resonates. And thank you for being so honest about the strengths, but also the pitfalls of our sector. I know we only have a few minutes left, and so I want to try and make sure that we end a little bit on time. So I'm going to move us into our closing question, which is a little bit about you know, how we will remember this moment. And the reason why I wanted to ask you this question is because you know, I'm the granddaughter of a former Black Panther. I have a number of family members that were engaged in the civil rights, the anti-war, the Black struggle movement of the 50s and 60s. And what an honor it is to be around people that can tell me about the history of that moment. And you know, we have all benefited, frankly, from the personal stories and the documentation of the struggles that people led and fought, you know, 50, you know, 60 years ago. I think a lot about that in relation to this moment. How will we remember, you know, the rise of Trump and the far right? How will we remember 2020 and the massive uprisings around the world in the aftermath of the murder of George Floyd? How will we remember this moment when it comes to the struggle to end the genocide and the occupation? And so, you know, in many ways, we're still in that moment. So the history of this moment has not been written. But I'm curious, when you think about future generations and how they will look back on this time, what do you hope they remember or see about our work today?
Yeah, it's really powerful to think about that. And I love this question because it kind of places you in time as well and allows you to see this bigger picture that we're in, you know. I hope that they can look back to us and not see us as collaborators. And there's so much that I believe they could, and so many reasons why they can. Not us here in the conference. But like Sanat had mentioned, so much of this sort of quote unquote liberal or mainstream pushback against Trump or even the far right is ostensibly coded or cloaked in the same violence that we're seeing so many other places around the world. And so much of the work that needs to be done is one that doesn't fall into these very easy traps that I feel we ought to be not only cognizant of and understanding that they exist, but feeling really cringy and fighting back or pushing back against them when we see it in our workplace, in how and where we develop campaigns, and what organizations we're sharing our work with or collaborating with. I think the movement itself needs more collaboration, especially to upend all of the different ways and sort of nexus of power that the opposition is. It's for somebody who spends a lot of time looking and analyzing the far right. They're very organized. Like it's a very organized space. They partner with all the right people to get into power, and so much of the quote unquote mainstream in the digital organizing world, if I'm in a panel and I say I'm in Palestine, I see them cringe or I see them sort of fluster. And in so many ways, I kind of know that's not, that doesn't necessarily need to be the allies that I'm fighting side by side with, but to be able to know that this movement that I'm happy to be fighting alongside with is growing is one that I think I want to look back to and feel that I had some role in participating in all of the work that is being done.
Thank you. And so now, how about you? What do you hope future generations remember, see about our work today, and what kind of legacy do you think we're building together today?
Thank you, Maisha. Sorry, I know we have like 1 minute left, but like this is such an important question because it highlights our need for like intergenerational learning. So like just as South African anti-apartheid movements inspired BLM, today's digital resistance from encryption to TikTok strikes, like these will inform future tactics against authoritarianism. And so like in this moment, I hope that they see that there was networked communities of resistance, that there was a solidarity culture, right? A global ecosystem where technologists, lawyers, and frontline activists can co-create strategies. And part of that strategy has to be building alternatives that break big tech's monopoly on this infrastructure that we're dependent on. And, I just want to end with that. There's been like so much discourse that's linking our current moment of repression with, and specifically I'm talking about Palestine, but with past liberation movements, whether it's Algeria, Vietnam, Black and Indigenous struggles in the United States, South Africa. Like oppressive regimes will always work to make you believe that you have no power, but resistance has always existed, and it existed, and it's always flourished, even if it is painful, and it always learns from each other.
Well, thank you so much, Sanaa and Mayan, for your time today, for inviting me to be a moderator for this really important conversation. I know we are essentially out of time, but for folks that have been joining, please look through all of the different links that